So you've purchased a basil plant from the store, you've brought it home, and now you may be thinking, now what? Well, don't worry. In this video, we're gonna cover everything you need to know to keep your basil plant healthy and thriving and producing lots of edible leaves. The first thing you're gonna wanna do is remove any plastic wrapping that came with the plant. It may look like this is something that's been put on to benefit the plant, but it's actually for ease of use by people. So this way, customers can either grab a bunch of them and carry them all together, or employees can grab a bunch of them when putting them on a shelf. But what this plastic wrapping actually does is traps humidity and moisture down into this bottom layer of stems, and you can get mold or mildew down there. So you wanna take that off as soon as you can. So once you take the plastic off, you'll want to inspect the plant. If you see any dead or dying leaves at the bottom here, you can go ahead and pull them off. And then the big thing to take note of when you get a plant like this is that it is not one giant bushy basil plant. It is a collection, usually, of multiple separate basil plants, which is wonderful. And the reason that they're purchased this way is for a single plant to grow this big would take months. But instead, they give you 20 plus individual plants, and together they make this nice basil bush. But it comes at a price. 20 different or so plants in one single small pot are all gonna be competing for room for their roots and food for their leaves and stems. And so you've got to make a decision right away how you're gonna solve for that. Otherwise, your basil plant's gonna struggle. So you've got a few options. You can either leave them all in here and just plan on keeping the plant small, but just remember, they're not gonna have a lot of room for their roots to stretch out or a lot of food to eat. So the plant just can't ever get that big. Or, which we're gonna do today, you can transplant the entire bunch into a larger pot or directly outside if your area meets the weather requirements of basil, which we'll also cover. Or third, you could turn each one of these stems into their very own basil plant and, give them away to 20 of your closest friends. Okay, so I've decided that I'm gonna transplant all of these individual stems into one larger pot size. This is a 2-gallon, and you can see the difference between the two pot sizes. This will allow for a ton more soil, which will equate to a lot more food for the plant, and it'll be a lot more space for all of these roots to stretch out and go find that food. So I'm gonna be jumping up to this 2-gallon sized pot. I'm gonna be using a high quality potting soil. Now, basil plants don't like to dry out, but they also don't want to be too soggy. A high quality potting soil will get you most of the way there. If you're able to add something like biochar, you can add some additional porosity or some additional ability for the soil to drain. So I'm gonna be adding that in. Don't panic if you don't have access to something like this. If you're gonna let the plant get big, it's most important that it gets into a larger pot with a high quality potting soil. But if you do have access to biochar, especially pre-charged biochar, this has been soaking in our fish tank water, so it's just packed full of extra nutrients for the plant to get. This is a great way to prevent your soil from compacting and preventing soggy pockets that your basil plant won't like. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go ahead and just kind of mix this in this 2-gallon pot. So I'm gonna do like a couple scoops of my potting soil, and then I'm gonna do a couple scoops of my biochar. So there's some good potting soil. I'm gonna do some biochar. Just a couple handfuls of that. In general, it's about like a 10% ratio biochar to your soil mixture. You can see I'm not measuring, but just as like a back of the napkin, that's kind of what I'm going for. Oh, and I have a really cool hack. We want this basil plant to be at about the top level of this pot. A cool way to see how much soil you should put in the bottom of your pot is to just go ahead and take your existing plant and put it in your new pot, and then you can look down and see like, oh, okay, I need to fill to about here in order to get the same level height. So that's about where I'm gonna fill to. So I'm gonna fill up a little bit more. And then I'm gonna add add a little bit more biochar mixed in. I love this stuff. I won't go into all the reasons that I love biochar. We actually did a separate video on all the amazing benefits of it and its very old history. I'll just say it's a really cool input if you've got it. Look at all of these individual basil plants. And oh, so look, you can already see. So that is a great sign that one, we've got a lot of healthy roots, but two, they have run out of room. All right, so let's get this planted. This plant's gonna be very happy to have room for those roots to stretch out. So I can see by putting it in here, I've done a nice height for my soil in the bottom. So now I'm just gonna fill in around the edges, and I'm actually just gonna use this old pot to kind of make my 90% soil, 10% biochar mix, and just fill in the gaps. And this biochar will add some really great drainage, as well as provide access to additional moisture, be a great home for microbes. Just really awesome stuff. And then of course, provide porosity, which is what, we really are going for. Anytime you transplant, you wanna try to not put soil up high on the stems. Oftentimes, plants that have soil touching their existing stems, that can cause the stem to rot. We're in a good situation here, and the basil plants can actually produce new roots from their stems, so it's not the end of the world if you do get soil high up on the stems, but it's good practice just to try to keep it where it originally was in its original pot. The other thing I'll say is anytime you transplant, I always try to bring as much as the current soil into the new pot. This is the established ecosystem for the plants, the established microbes, and I just think it helps to cut down on the transplant shock if you can bring as much of its original home along with it. So we've certainly done that here. All right, now let's talk about where this plant can go. If it is no longer getting below 50 degrees at night where you live, then you can move this plant outside. Similarly, you can also do the same thing I did, but put this entire plant directly into the ground. Now here's a caveat. This plant wants to be around 70 to 80 degrees. That's its optimal temperature. If it gets too hot or too dry, that can stress the plant and actually cause it to bolt, also known as flowering. That's what's gonna change the taste of the leaves and make it so the plant is no longer really usable for food. So if you are gonna put the plant outside, which is what I'm gonna do, you wanna make sure you do two things. First, you give the plant time to harden off. So if it's really sunny out, you're only gonna leave the plant outside for a little bit, then you're gonna move it back into the shade. Leaves develop a cuticle layer which act as sunblock, and that cuticle layer gets thicker the more it's exposed to sunlight. If you just put them out, they're gonna get burned and the leaves can die. If you give the plant time to build that cuticle layer up, have it in the sun, then move it to the shade, a little bit longer in the sun, a little bit more in the shade, you'll be good to go. After you've hardened your plant off, it's important to keep an eye on the temperature. If it gets above 85, 90 degrees, this can stress your plant out and cause it to flower or bolt, and you'll no longer be able to use it. So I'm gonna be keeping this on my back deck. If it's gonna be a hot day, I'm either gonna move it into the shade and or move it inside altogether to make it last as long as possible. Lighting needs. Your plant is gonna want at least 6 hours of sunlight. These are a tropical variety. They want bright, full sun. But like I said, unless you haven't hardened your plant off yet, or if it's extremely hot out, then you can go ahead and move it into the shade. Second of all, they want to be moist, but they don't want to be soggy. So water regularly, especially if the top inch of soil is dry, it needs more water. Now, let's talk about nutrient needs. Because we're not asking this plant to produce flowers and seeds, we want it to stay producing leaves. We really just need to make sure the plant has plenty of nitrogen. Phosphorus can actually cause the plant to flower, which is not what we want. So a good potting soil is going to do most of the heavy lifting for you. However, if you start to see your leaves yellowing, it could be a sign that the plant is running out of nitrogen. You'll want to pick a fertilizer that you can add to the top that has a good amount of nitrogen, but not too much phosphorus or potassium, because we're not worried about the flowering stage of the plant. And then the last thing, pruning. We're going to prune this plant for 2 reasons. The main reason, we want to eat these leaves. The second reason, we don't want these shoots to turn into flowers. So I'm going to show you exactly how to do it to keep your plant looking like this and only getting bigger and bushier with delicious leaves. Let's get into it. When you're picking leaves off your plant, don't pick from the bottom. And also, don't just peel off an individual leaf. What you want to do is you want to follow your stem up and find where there's a node. And you can see here that this plant is already getting ready to put out 2 little baby leaves. What you want to do is prune the plant nice and tight to this node. What will happen is the plant will stop putting its energy into going up and trying to flower, but instead will turn these 2 little nodes into the new main stems. And if you do this over and over again, your plant will just get bushier and bushier and bushier. You never want to take away more than 1/3 of the plant's leaves. That's a good rule of thumb. So I'm going to show you just what I'm going to do. If I wanted to have leaves to eat for dinner tonight, and I want to prevent this from turning into a flower, I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to cut right here. These little leaves here will continue to grow and become new primary stems and put out new growth. So let's do one more just to show you how it's done. So you can see this was the primary stem, and it's been clipped already, although it was clipped a little bit too high. I'm going to clean it up. But you can see those little baby leaves on either side are going to become new primary stems. They've already put out 2 leaves. They'll continue to grow up, and then we can prune those, making this plant bushier and bushier. So I'm going to take this top off so it's just nice and tight to the bottom growth here. And this will continue to grow up and become even more basil plant. And I've got this to eat. And I can do that for all of the tops. The reason you don't want your basil plant to bolt or flower is because the basil plant is producing essential oils that make the leaves taste sweet. However, when the plant goes into flower, it stops producing those oils, making the leaves more bitter and also thicker and more fibrous. So we want to make sure that doesn't happen. For more great tips and tricks on how to grow life where you live, including what to do with your newly bought basil plant, be sure to like and subscribe. Bye everybody.